Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. The word for today is plumbing. I know, not the sexiest part of a car. And I can't say anyone's looked at a car and uttered the words, now that's a sexy radiator hose. Okay, that might not be entirely true, because the radiator hoses did come out kinda sexy. So, you can't buy custom molded radiator hoses. You'd think someone would have gotten to that niche, but the choices are either universal accordion style hoses or silicone couplers and aluminum tubes. And I'm not a fan of either, so I made my own hoses. I started with two 90-degree molded sections for each hose and whittled on them until I was happy with the way they fit. Then I used an aluminum coupler to join them together and covered the splice with heat shrink radiator hose clamps. These things come from the heavy truck industry, and I like how discreet their appearance is. They make the hoses come really close to looking like a single piece. I'm thinking about scuffing them down to remove the glossy sheen and lettering, which I think would make them look like a single piece. Installation was pretty easy. For the top hose, the thermostat housing on the MX-5 points to the passenger side from the factory, so I flipped it around to point it to the driver's side, and the hose climbed up to the radiator neck pretty cleanly. The bottom hose was a little more fun. Originally, the lower radiator hose attached to an aluminum and steel manifold that joined the lower inlet and heater core return line up behind the exhaust manifold. I removed it since I wanted something a little cleaner, and while I had the thermostat off to fit the upper hose, I got curious, and turns out the bolt spacing for the water inlet and outlet are the same. And there's plenty of meat for the gasket to seal them together, so one new thermostat housing later, and I had the clean water inlet I was looking for. And the cool part is, it angles forward just enough for the hose to clear the block, and angles out just enough so the hose doesn't hit the crank pulley. It's still a little naked looking up front, but when everything's done, I think it'll come out looking pretty good. Moving back, let's talk exhaust. Have a little chat about the O2 sensor plug. I got the little guy installed and looks like a tight fit, but the header and engine side of the motor mount don't move relative to one another, so 1/4 inch? Tons of room. I also got the exhaust installed. 2¼ inches of mandrel bent goodness. I could have had the pipes press bent, but ew. It bolts to the header with a ball and socket joint and passes right next to the master cylinders, which got plumbed as well. The small lines in the front run to the calipers and clutch safe cylinder, but on top are relocation caps that are plumbed with stainless tees and EPDM rubber line, and they run back and transition into a copper line that snakes up the firewall to a remote mounted reservoir, which is aluminum and has enough capacity to support all 3 cylinders, and looks way better than a plastic remote reservoir. I mounted it just above the steering column with 2 stainless bands, and the brakes were done. Well, not quite. I had to run the hard lines, which, for the front brakes, run forward below the chassis to the front cross member. At that point, they tee off with one line going to the passenger side where it meets the brake light switch before transitioning into a soft line that leads to the passenger's front caliper. And the other end doubles back and attaches to a soft line leading to the driver's front caliper. On the passenger side is the soft line to the caliper, and you can see inside the body the brake line that runs forward to the cross member, which, if you back up and look at the outside of the rocker, there's a slew of holes in the louvered section where the body would have attached to the pan, so I used those holes to hold the hard lines that run throughout the car. Once the finished hardware and nicer clamps are installed, it should look rather period since Type 35s have nuts and bolts installed all over the lower quarter of the body. Back to the cooling system for a sec though. I closed off the port in the water neck with a rubber plug and used another shrink clamp to hold it in place. Then came the plumbing for the overflow tank, which started with this little piece of molded rubber line that transitions into a copper hard line that I bent so it'd make its way down the radiator and run back under the frame, where it pokes back out of the firewall and snakes upward to its aluminum overflow tank, which, again, aluminum beats plastic. I plumbed the tank so it's not under pressure. First, I plugged the outlet in the water neck to seal it off. Then I installed a vent in the upper inlet port to let the tank breathe. So, as long as there's coolant in the tank, the radiator's full. The cool part is, even though the tank isn't under pressure, it has a 16-pound cap just like the radiator. So, if anything happens and the cap on the radiator fails, the cap on the overflow can be swapped in its place and you can keep on driving. I also got another stainless vent and put it in place of the PCV valve. I'm not running an air box, so this will vent crankcase pressure a little more sveltely than a paper element style filter hanging off the valve cover. Oh, back to the cooling system. I also fabbed up a coolant sensor manifold. Originally the heater core outlet exited here, but I needed a place to mount all the coolant temp sensors. Would have been nice to run just a single sensor, but picky resistance-based sensors just don't like to share a common circuit. So, the top one is a fan switch, the lower one with the black end is for the fuel injection, and the red-ended one is for the temp gauge on the dash. And since water mixes so well with oil, let's move to the oiling system. Not a lot here, but what is here is clean, and what is here is the oil filter. The 1.8s came from the factory with an oil preheater sandwich plate, which I removed and installed in its place a shorter oil pipe from a 1.6 motor for a cleaner look. And just behind the oil filter is the oil pressure sender, which is mounted directly behind the throttle body and kind of gets hidden away out of sight really nicely. Next, up front and center, is the throttle body, now with fuel lines added for better performance. The soft lines run down and connect to a pair of hard lines that travel back along under the frame rail into the cockpit, which, if you look just under the driver's side rail, you can see a pair of clamps. But if you stick your head down real low, you can see the brake line running through the passenger's compartment towards the rear of the car. And if you move to the driver's side of the car, you can see a matching pair of clamps on the passenger side rocker, which, when you stick your head down into the cockpit again, are holding the fuel system hard lines, which run back and transition into soft lines again at the rear boat tail, which, tucked back here, is where the fuel pump is hidden. It's wrapped in closed cell foam and suspended from rubber isolated stainless steel straps, which should make it significantly quieter. But the pump itself is so cool. It's a 155-liter OEM replacement from a Mustang SVO, and it mounts with Bundy fittings to the fuel line which don't require a tool to remove. So, if the pump ever goes out, reach back, drop the straps, push the fittings buttons, and the pump comes right out. Has to be about the easiest fuel pump in the world to replace. Once you get past the pump, the fuel lines run up the chassis. One, the fuel return line, arcs up to the top of the tank with a nifty little fitting that I made that's completely hidden from view. And the other is the supply line, which runs back behind the fuel tank bracket to the rear cross member, through a fuel filter, and up into the fuel tank. It'll get a strap to hold the filter next time I take the boat tail off, but Since we still got our heads back here, you can also see where the brake line for the driver's caliper enters the body and runs around, back down the frame, across the rear crossmember to the driver's side rail, and forward to a T where the driver's side caliper connects. On the outside, you can see where the soft line runs from the caliper to the body, which isn't the finished placement, but pretty close until the lower section of the rocker is refabricated. I also got the rear exhaust hanger tack welded in. The straps wrap around the exhaust pipe and attach to the bracket with a tab that bolts to the hanger. If you look, I can move back to the passenger side and we can get a better angle. You can see how the tab stretches down and allows for not only the little bit of movement the exhaust needs, but the ability to adjust the gap between the exhaust pipe and the body so I can tuck the exhaust up right where I want it. And that's all she wrote for now. I guess we can part company with a little aluminum eye candy and stare at the firewall mounted reservoirs for a bit. Which, okay, I like them. They come out really nice. But I gotta say, I'm really amped about what's coming up next.